I'm Ryan O'Dowd, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with section 511, Coup D'Etat by Edward Luttwak. We're starting chapter 4, The Planning of the Coup D'Etat. Open quote. Even barricades, apparently a mechanical element of the uprising, are of significance in reality above all as a moral force. Lev Davidovich Bronstein, Trotsky. In the early morning of 23rd of April, 1961, elements of the 1st Foreign Legion Parachute Regiment seized the key points of the city of Algiers in the name of Generals Charles Zeller, Jouhad, and Salan. The four generals, because of their personal prestige and their position in the French hierarchy, quickly asserted their control over the local military command and started to extend their authority over all the armed forces in Algeria. At this time, de Gaulle's government was in the process of opening negotiations with the Algerian nationalists, and the generals were determined to replace him with a leader who would carry the war to a victorious conclusion. The French armed forces in Algeria were much more powerful than those stationed in France and Germany, and the four generals were hopeful that, once their allegiance was assured, they would find it easy to take effective control of the French government. After all, de Gaulle himself had come to power after a similar episode in May 1958, and there seemed to be no major obstacle to a successful second edition of the famous 13 Mai. When the four generals made their declaration over Algiers radio, the 1st, 14th, and 18th Colonial Parachute Regiments rallied to the coup. A few infantry units, some of the Marines, and much of the Air Force remained loyal to the de Gaulle, as in May 1958 they had remained loyal to the Fourth Republic. But most of the armed forces in Algeria were attentiste. Wait and see is the attitude that usually favors a coup. And when General Henri de Pouilly withdrew his headquarters from Oran to Tlemcen to avoid having to choose between fighting or joining the coup, he was objectively favoring the coup. The four generals seemed to be on the verge of victory. The determined Pieds Noirs population of Algeria was 100% behind them. The powerful parachute units gave them a hard-hitting force of intervention, and the bulk of the armed forces were either for them or neutral. Even the forces loyal to de Gaulle's government did nothing actively to oppose the coup. While the leaders of the coup started to gather support, the French defense minister was on a visit to Morocco. Maurice Papon, the head of the Paris police, was on vacation. Debray, the prime minister and chief firefighter of the regime, was ill. De Gaulle himself was entertaining the visiting president of Senegal, Senghor. Other ministers were on visits to Algiers itself, and were promptly captured and held in confinement together with other representatives of the president. Everything pointed to an early victory of the coup, and yet a few days later, General Shaw was being flown to Paris for eventual trial and imprisonment. Salan and the others were fleeing to the interior, on their way to exile or capture, and the 1st Foreign Legion Parachute Regiment drove back to their barracks singing Edith Piaf's Je ne regrette rien, though their officers were under arrest and their unit was to be disbanded. Why did the coup fail? Perhaps the main reason was that the four generals had utterly neglected the political forces, and had allowed the immediate power of the armed forces to obscure the somewhat less immediate but ultimately decisive role they could play. In the Gaullist coup of May 1958, the action of the military and the population of Algiers had been supported by the Gaullist infiltration of the civil service, and by the steady corrosion of the will of other political groups to oppose the dissolution of the Fourth Republic. This time the generals had simply ignored the civilians. De Gaulle went on television and called for popular support. Français, adisement. Debray, who followed him on the screen, was more specific. Go to the airports. Convince the soldiers who are misled. He also started to arm a militia drawn from the Gaullist party. More important, the trade union organizations, the communists, the Christian Democrats, and the Force Ouvrière all rallied around the government, while most political parties did the same. The left-wing Catholic movement started to organize its sit-down strikes among the national servicemen in Algeria, and in general, most organized forces of French society intervened and refused to accept the authority of the coup. The effect of this refusal was decisive. The larger part of the wait-and-see element in the armed forces stopped waiting and declared its support for de Gaulle, and this was the end of the coup. We will only be able to avoid a repetition of the crucial error made by the generals if we can neutralize the political forces as effectively as the military ones. Immediate political power is always concentrated in the country's government, but in every country and under all political systems there will be groups outside the government and even outside formal politics, which also have the political power. Their source of strength can be their ability to influence particular groups of voters, as in democratic societies, or the control over certain organizations which are important in the country's political life. Whether these groups, which we have called the political forces, are pressure groups, political parties, or other associations, does not greatly matter. What is of importance is their ability to participate in the formation of governments, and later, to influence their decisions. The nature of the forces which are important in the political life of a particular country will reflect the structure of its society and economy, and it will also depend on the particular context of decision-making. If, for example, we were asked to list the most important forces in British political life, we could produce the following rather conventional list. The two major political parties, the Trade Union Congress and certain major unions, the Confederation of British Industry, the senior civil service academic complex, the city and its corporations, and the press. But if we were asked to isolate the groups which would matter in foreign policy decision about, say, the Middle East, we'd come up with a quite different list. The two major British and part British oil companies, the Foreign Office Academic Arabist Group, the Central Organization of British Jews. In a sophisticated society with its complex industrial and social structure, there are hundreds of organizations which, whatever their primary purpose, also acts as pressure groups in attempts to influence political decisions in a manner that serves their members' interests. These organizations will reflect in their divergent attitudes the diversity of a complex society. In economically backwards countries, however, the society of society is simpler, and any conflict of interest, though just as strong, is played out in a much smaller arena and with fewer participants. In Africa south of the Sahara, religious groups are generally fragmented and apolitical, and where the local business community is still relatively small and weak, the major political forces are limited to a few groupings. Tribal and ethnic groups, trade unions, students in graduates associations, civil service officials and officers of the armed forces, and the activists of the ruling political party. There's a table here, Table 10. The groups which would influence the formation of American policy on Middle Eastern questions, formal and unofficial participants. Official, the President and the White House staff, the Department of State, the Pentagon, the CIA as a supplier of information, and the key congressional committees. Unofficial, A, oil companies with interest in the Middle East. These seek to protect and extend their interests and therefore advocate sympathetic understanding for Arab aspirations and policies. B, oil companies with exclusively domestic interests. These favor a continuation of the existing policy of excluding foreign oil from U.S. market, and are therefore inimical to any general U.S.-Arab rapprochement. C, other energy industries, which also oppose any relaxation of present U.S. import controls on cheap foreign oil. D, politicians with significant Jewish populations in their constituencies. These naturally follow a visible pro-Israel line on congressional voting and make appropriate speeches. E, pro-Zionist organizations of American Jewry. F, American Council for Judaism. This body is anti-Zionist and opposes the pro-Israel elements in this field. And G, the academic bodies with a specific interest in Arab or Middle Eastern studies. These usually identify with Arab views and seek a sympathetic hearing of Arab claims. Moving on. In much of West Africa, one would have to add the local market traders association, and in immediate sub-Saharan areas, the traditional Muslim leadership structures. In Asia, religious groups and their leaders would have to be added to the list, and in some countries, such as Taiwan, Thailand, South Korea, and Hong Kong, the local business class will be of importance. Missing from all the lists are the foreign business interests, which may play an important or even dominant role, but which represent a special problem already dealt with in Chapter 2. Whatever groups dominate the political scene of our target country in normal times, the special circumstances of the coup will mean that only a few elements among them will be important to us. Political forces can intervene against the coup in two ways. They can rally and deploy the masses, or some part of them, against the new government, and they can manipulate technical facilities under their control in order to oppose the consolidation of power. The action of individual, political, religious, ethnic, or intellectual leaders who could use the framework of their party or community against us is an example of the first kind of intervention. A strike of the staff of the radio television service is an example of the second. A general strike would, in effect, combine both kinds of intervention. And we will finish with Section 511 there. We'll move on tomorrow to Section 512, Neutralizing the Political Forces 1, General. We're still in Coup D'Etat by Edward Luttwak. I will see you then. Olam.